Good afternoon. And thank you for your interest in my research. It's going to be very much a personal reflection on what is work in progress. So what I'm hoping to, or what I will be covering, I'm going to introduce myself and my background, and it will become very clear why, because my research is very much a reflection of who I am. And that's something that I needed to explore during my PhD. It's where do I find my authenticity as a researcher? So I'll say a bit about who I am and my background, share with you the research questions and how that led to the approach that I've taken. Very quickly look at the models and frameworks that have been used and where the data has come from. My key findings to date and what this actually means, the kind of so what question, and particularly in the area of future research. So I'm hoping that will keep you interested. So me, I'm a PhD student here, and I'm in the School of Psychology, which is an interesting one because mine is a transdisciplinary study. I initially applied to be in the business school, but ended up in the School of Psychology with two supervisors, one from psychology and one from LIBS. And it's very interesting because there's so many different aspects to my topic that I'm here in the School of Psychology. My background is in management and in teaching, consultancy and training, so I'm a member of the CMI and the Foundation for Learning. I have an MSc in mindfulness-based approaches and had 30 plus years of working in the voluntary and community sector, particularly around the area of community engagement and empowerment. So I've been an entrepreneur and a social entrepreneur. I ran my own businesses and then set up my own social enterprise, and I'm an engaged Buddhist. So my study is very much a reflection of some of my values and my beliefs. So my research question was, in what ways can entrepreneur education support the development of pro-social values and behaviour? So we know about the Sustainable Development Goals, we know about corporate social responsibility, we know about equality, diversity and inclusion. But is that really going to influence an entrepreneur to act in ways that are pro-social? Particularly given that most of the people I interviewed hadn't heard of many of those. And then the next question was, could that question be answered by creating knowledge from within the ecosystem and create the knowledge in ways that recognise, harness and celebrate the messiness of that sector, rather than applying a kind of fairly simplistic approach, actually get really into entrepreneur and all the different stakeholders within that area. So my approach has been to use data to underpin the theory building and to identify, really for me, what is puzzling rather than where the gaps are in the literature. It was about engaging different disciplines, adopting a very participative approach, and one that linked to engaged scholarship. But it was about doing things my way, adopting an entrepreneurial approach to doing a PhD, which is quite interesting because that was reflected in a paper that I've just written, or just read rather, about the future strategy of the university and the need for us researchers to be more entrepreneurial. And that meant being brave enough to be disruptive within an area that I wasn't 100% comfortable in, i.e. academia. So it was about being transdisciplinary rather than interdisciplinary. But the big one was about building collaborative networks to support my work. And then linking back the data to the models and the frameworks, rather than the models and the frameworks being the driving force. So these were the models and frameworks that started to become relevant. And it was very much for me about trying to develop my understanding of entrepreneurship theoretically, but then linking sort of academic study to the background of community engagement. So what have been my findings so far? Well, these were the key findings. The world needs people to be more prosocial. We're facing unprecedented challenges, but actually sustainable development goals aren't enough. They're not working fully. It's interesting if you look at the individual development goals which are coming to the fore, you can start to see why. It's about linking it to people. The nature of being an entrepreneur is changing, and people are starting to challenge. What does it mean? So, very interesting lecture that I attended the other day. There was linking entrepreneurs and Uber drivers as entrepreneurs to the exploitation of coal farmers and cotton workers in America. Do we use the term entrepreneur to exploit people? So there's issues there for me. What I also found was that entrepreneurs can make a significant contribution to society, but more importantly, they have an appetite to do so. And also, mindfulness as a tool is moving away from being focused on clinical interventions and is going back to having a more political agenda. And finally, what I also found out was that entrepreneur education is evolving. And that brings opportunities. And I think it brings a great opportunity to incorporate prosociality into the agendas, into the curriculum. So the nature and sources of the data from which those findings came, I had a student placement in my first year, and the student from De Montfort University did a small-scale survey of entrepreneur students to ask what they wanted from entrepreneur education and where they saw prosociality fitting in. Did an online quantitative survey of the information from that survey, then informed some semi-structured interviews with past, present and future entrepreneurs and people at different stages of their entrepreneur journey. The data from those interviews then informed a number of homogeneous focus groups, which because of the COVID had to be conducted online. So those focus groups included entrepreneurs, student entrepreneurs, academics, business advisors, commercial trainers and coaches. We've got a whole wealth of material from them about how we might translate that into a learning and development approach. What I'm doing now is taking the data from the interviews and from the focus groups, and I'm designing activities, learning and development activities, which are being piloted by entrepreneurs by people who deliver entrepreneur training, and I have an advisory group of so-called experts who are providing feedback on the trialling of this material. And what will happen next year is that I will pull it together into an intervention that will then look to be piloting. Other sources of data are analytic autoethnography. So that's using myself as a research subject. And what is interesting in the area of academic publishing, that seems to be getting traction. And there are a lot of people who are interested in that approach and the kind of ongoing environmental scaling. But what puzzles me is how do you provide learning and development opportunities that encourage people to act and to support them to act in ways that are pro-social, and doing it in a way that kind of harnesses different motivations. When I interviewed the entrepreneurs, I interviewed sort of 20, I suppose, entrepreneurs, very, very few of them, they were asked, can you give me an example of a time that you acted in a way that was pro-social? And tell me about it. What motivated you? What were the barriers? What helped you to act in this way? Very, very few, I think 2, acted out of pure altruism. A whole raft of other motivations for acting in ways that are pro-social. So any intervention will need to recognise that and build upon it, instead of perhaps assuming that people are pro-social because they are altruistic. It's not the same. How do you create a learning intervention that doesn't impose an additional burden upon them, where they can actually see value to themselves in acting in that way, that is relevant and accessible? Interestingly, there was quite a lot of comment that people felt that maybe entrepreneur education wasn't always relevant and accessible. But what is most important is how do you then robustly evaluate an intervention?
2 more minutes.
Yeah, so the theoretical model, I'm aiming for simplicity, but the model is evolving. I don't want to go with an existing model, I want to get the model developed from the data. So it's work in progress. But the next steps are to continue working within the entrepreneur ecosystem, the design and piloting of an intervention, and then assessing what is the potential of that intervention for scaling up. And that means working very closely with policymakers and decision makers. And that's why it's been really useful to have them included in the focus group, because they're part of the audience of people who are trialling the materials and commenting on it. And I think what will happen, because what I decided to do is to communicate what I was doing as I went along. So I have a website and a LinkedIn group, and I think what will evolve from that is a community of practice. My references, and over to you.
Okay.
Maybe a very different approach, hopefully.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Maureen. So, any questions or feedback, comments? Maureen's thoughts?
I was just wondering about the entrepreneurs, who they were they small businesses or medium
All
sized?
sizes.
All sizes.
All sizes, yes.
Yeah.
So we looked at, what was more important to me, first of all, was the different stages of their journey, because I recognised that any learning and development intervention needed to take that into account.
Yeah.
So the different stages of the journey, different industries, some service industry, some sort of manufacturing. But if I'm honest, there's only a couple of people that were from a really large company. Most were smaller and medium-sized.
So do you predict there will be a very different set of data or findings in terms of the size and also the industry? Will it be very different? Or so far, based on
So far, not really. Not really, and that's why it very much seemed to be about the individual.
There's always the middle things, aren't they?
Yeah.
In business.
Yeah, it's the individual. I
Doing
defined,
things, too busy to fit things.
Yeah. I defined entrepreneur as somebody who set up and ran a business, working with the people who set it up, but it was very much a reflection of them.
And also maybe how long their journeys are, right? Or how the history of their business.
Absolutely.
Those who are just a few years versus those of over 20 years could be very different, right?
Yeah. And so they're very different for the person who was just about to hand over their business. It was quite different to the person who was starting up, definitely.
It's also a learning process for the entrepreneur, right?
And
learning process for them as well, right?
And the person who had family responsibilities is different. Female entrepreneurs, some of the responses were quite different. Yeah.
Yes. Any questions for Maureen? No. Okay, thank you so much.